Well, welcome to the online version of History and Politics of Sports. This is Professor Gehrz. You're going to hear from Professor Moore later as we go through the semester online together. We knew when we designed this course that teaching it for the first time, there'd be some unexpected moments that we would have to make some changes. We certainly did not expect anything like this. So first of all, thank you for your patience in bearing with us as we try to figure out how to do this class online. And we'll try to extend the same patience to you. Everyone's going through a lot of change right now. You've got other classes doing other things. So we'll try our best. Just to remind you how this is going to work, at least this first week, and then this kind of becomes a template for later weeks. We'll start with online kind of narrated PowerPoint, which will actually break into this time, I think, 3 or 4 different chunks, maybe each 10 to 15 minutes long, which we're sharing as videos that you're watching and listening to. And then you'll have individual and then group reading assignments and kind of a response. So this will function kind of like an open book 2-question Monte Carlo quiz that you'll do individually on Moodle for Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, you'll use like a shared Google Doc to work together on kind of narrowing down your answers into a couple of responses that you'll share with us. And that then becomes the basis for an episode of the 252 on Thursday. That's our course podcast we've been doing for a long time. Now we're really making it fully a part of the class. So you'll hear Professor Moore, myself, and our colleague Professor Mulberry talk through our topic for the week, which is race and sports, specifically the experience of African Americans in American sports history. So to get started, let me remind you of where we left things off before spring break in the second quarter on sports in American society. You might remember I put up this statement: how do sports in American history both advance liberty and equality and belie these truths? And you might remember this comes from a book by the Harvard history professor Joe Lepore called These Truths, which takes its title from the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's notion that liberty and equality, among others, are truths self-evident. They don't need any proof. They're part of the human experience, or at least the human aspiration, and that should be the basis for a government in this country. And in a sense, maybe sports can show us the advance of those truths, but the other theme of Lepore's book is that American history also makes a lie of these truths, that we don't always seek liberty or equality. And you can see that in sports. And so the week before spring break, we talked about women in sports and gender and sexuality. And so I put up this image from the last Women's World Cup of Megan Rapinoe, the star player for the U.S. women's national team, the world champions, who is an out lesbian and a pretty politically active figure as well. And think of how different that is from where we started the 20th century with women in sports. But you might remember that next to Rapinoe's picture was another image. And I told you this was a young Jackie Robinson as an athlete at UCLA, where he lettered in 4 different sports, not just baseball, for which he became famous, but here you see him as a track and field athlete as well. And so now we're going to turn from gender to race and think about how African Americans' experience of sports both show the advance of liberty and equality and belying these truths. And this is obviously a serious chapter in American history. There's not much less like liberty than slavery, and there's not much less like equality than a racialized hierarchy in which one race oppresses another or others. And so before we get anywhere near sports, let me just try to give you a way of thinking about the seriousness of the topic of race in America. Last August, the New York Times published a special issue of its magazine called the 1619 Project. It came out on the 400th anniversary of the first slaves coming to the Jamestown colony in coastal Virginia in 1619. And the argument of this project, which has been controversial among historians, but I think is worth taking seriously, is that the origin story, if you will, of America does not start with Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence in 1776. What if the origin story of America was slaves coming to an English colony in the New World in 1619? It would certainly change how we tell that story, how we feel about that story. It's certainly a more complicated story. And so, again, there's debate about how valid this is, but there's certainly some truth to this truth, which is that slavery has always been a part of the American experience, that deepest kind of unfreedom. And by the end of the 18th century, it's purely racially based slavery, and it enshrines white supremacy. And I guess the story for this introductory video is how even when slavery is gone, that white supremacy continues. And we won't talk a lot about sports in this first video, but it will pretty clearly show up in sports by the end of the 19th century. So let's get started with part one of our introductory series on race and sports. From slavery to segregation. We're not going to go deeply into the history of slavery in America, but we do want to give you a sense of, at least by the mid-19th century, what it looks like. So let me show you one of the most famous data visualizations in American history. This is a map from the time of the Civil War. Notice that it says it's being sold for the benefit of soldiers and sailors. This was used by the Union to help illustrate that the Civil War was indeed about ending slavery. Certainly by 1863 when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. So what this map shows you is based on census data from 1860. It shows the density of the African American population in the southern and border states, so the Confederacy, and then states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, where slavery was still legal even after the Emancipation Proclamation. So in 1860, there were 4.4 million African Americans in the United States. About 5% of them lived in free states in the North and way out west, California and Oregon. 95% of them lived in slavery in the South. And so the darker the color, the higher the proportion of African Americans in the deepest South of the Confederacy. But of course, the Civil War ends with a Union triumph and with the defeat of slavery. Even before the Confederacy surrenders in the spring of 1865, the United States Congress passes the 13th Amendment, which is then ratified by the states. So this is the subject matter of Steven Spielberg's film Lincoln, which tells you the story of the 13th Amendment. And then after that, in the succeeding years, you get the 14th Amendment, which enshrines equality, not just at the federal level, but at the state level. And then the 15th Amendment, which specifically guarantees the right to vote for black men, although tellingly not for women, although that was hotly debated at the time. So this is the beginning of what's called Reconstruction, which is a pretty remarkable experiment in, frankly, multiracial democracy. By 1870, you've got former slaves and black freedmen who are serving as political leaders in the United States Senate and Congress, as governors, as mayors, at all levels of Southern society. You've got an attempt at racial equality and equal opportunity. There's economic change, educational change, land reform taking place. In 1875, the U.S. Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, as it's called, which extends the protections of the 14th Amendment to even the private sector. So, for example, it was illegal under that law to have racial discrimination in hotels or in transportation. But by that point, the government was not eager to enforce it, and there had been considerable friction. The only way that Reconstruction was able to make any headway is that the U.S. Army actually occupied the South in order to protect African Americans and then white allies from essentially a campaign of terrorism, most famously leading to the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. But in 1876, there's a hotly contested presidential election, and a compromise is worked out. The Democrats agreed to seat Rutherford B. Hayes, former Union general, as Republican president, but in exchange, the U.S. Army left the South, and by 1877, Reconstruction is over. And pretty quickly, things turn against this experiment in democracy. And essentially, white supremacy is re-enshrined as blacks lose the right to vote through measures like the poll tax. They lose access to political leadership, and you get a new set of laws that are often called Jim Crow. And so this is the formal beginning of segregation as those laws go into effect around the South. But it's not just the South. And in the North, you get not always legal segregation, but at least de facto segregation, and certainly the minimization of black rights. And here we can review something we have talked about from sports history. In 1884, there's a player in the American Association, the second major league, called Moses Fleetwood Walker, or Fleet Walker. But white players like Cap Anson of the Chicago White Stockings refused to play against him. And over the next 3 years, organized baseball, both major and minor league baseball, implements what's called the color line. So this is never formalized. This is held in place by what's called the gentleman's agreement between owners, and players go along with it. It's possible, as we talked about at the beginning of March, because owners have the reserve clause, and they make decisions about who gets to play for how much, for how long, for which teams. And even white activists like John Montgomery Ward don't challenge that aspect of baseball's business structure. So baseball is just one example of segregation, but it shows up in lots of places, including transportation. You get separate sections on trains and buses for whites and blacks. And in the 1890s in New Orleans, a group of whites and blacks decided to challenge that. And an African-American man named Homer Plessy intentionally sits in the white section of a train in Louisiana, is arrested, and it becomes a test case for these segregation laws for Jim Crow. It makes it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in one of that court's most infamous decisions, in 1896, in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court agrees that segregation is constitutional. You can have racially separate institutions as long as they are, at least in theory, equal. And so you get separate schools, separate water fountains, separate hospitals. Everything in the South becomes separate, and this is all deemed constitutional. Again, in the North, it's a little bit different. You don't have the formalized structures of Jim Crow, but you have a great deal of informal segregation, and certainly life for African Americans is not easy in the North, any more so than in the South. You do have a little bit of integration in the sports world. This is a picture of a Chicago high school from about 1903 on the South Side, Hyde Park. So you see the one black player in the middle of the white players. But even for African Americans in the North, this is a difficult time. This is the beginning of a period of lynching. We've kind of talked about that briefly, maybe in the story of boxing and Jack Johnson. Come back to him in the next episode. And in 1903, a significant book is published by a sociologist and historian named W.E.B. Du Bois. It's called The Souls of Black Folk. And it's essentially his attempt to tell the story of the African American experience. In the very beginning of that book, Du Bois has a famous line that I think is worth pondering as we launch into the history of sports and African Americans in the 20th century. He writes this: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And in some ways, the problem of the 21st century might still be the problem of a different kind of color line." That'll be the topic of our last video in this opening series. And so as we pick things up in the next segment, we'll talk about what segregation looks like, what separate but equal looks like in the sports world. We'll talk about attempts to create Negro baseball leagues, separate but not quite equal institutions. And then we'll talk about the problems with that and how that leads to integration in the story of Jackie Robinson and other pioneers.